So we can see over here, there is a mixture of hairs of different sizes, hair follicles of different widths. And what we know from androgenetic alopecia and female pattern hair loss, right? Essentially the same disorder over here in the follicle. And I'm tempted to say that this is where the stem cell bulge is. It looks like there's an inflammation occurring, and that's causing the follicle disrupted, broken, right? Over here, the follicle even breaks apart. And when I say follicle, I'm not saying the hair inside of the follicle. I mean the literal hair follicle that's growing the hair. These organs, fatty structure, is important for hair growth. It's breaking. It's just breaking. Hey guys, before we continue this video, I would like to mention that we now have liposomal monoxidil sulfate on my website, folligens.com, folligens.com, and if the order queue is available and open, you can order it there. We're running it as a cosmetic. There are other sort of botanicals inside of this particular topical that are pretty helpful when it comes to conditioning the hair. So that's at folligens.com, folligens.com. That's folligens.com. Go check it out and maybe even try it out. See you there. Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another ad hoc video, and today we're going to be discussing the topic of hair loss and ultrasound imaging, and what can you actually see with ultrasound imaging, and what information can it possibly give you. Now, I've already written about this. It looks like it's already ranked on Google Images, but this particular image you see here on the right, let's see if we can blow it up a bit. This image you see here on the right is from Dr. Ximena Wortsman, and it's from one of our various studies on ultrasound imaging and the scalp. And in this case, you view the scalp and you can see at what state of the anagen cycle a particular hair follicle is in. And the reason why this has some useful information is because you can see what percentage of your hair follicles are in the catagen phase. As we know, once a hair follicle enters the catagen phase, it's essentially resting. It's no longer growing and it's preparing itself to shed. So you can essentially predict the future on how severe your shedding will be. With that being the case, you can also get the actual, dormant, I guess you can say, the follicles that are in telogen, right? Telogen are follicles that no longer have hair, or they're about to, exit out of having hair. A hair is going to fall out soon, right? And there is some, I guess, classification. It can be like the exogen phase. The exogen phase is when technically, it's subset of telogen, but it's when the hair actually leaves the follicle. And the kenogen phase, if I remember correctly, is when the hair is essentially dormant. The hair follicle is essentially dormant, right? So what this image over here is essentially telling us is the closer the follicle is to the outer layer, the stratum corneum, the outer layer of the skin, the more likely it is to either be in catagen or telogen. Does that make sense? So the deeper it is, the more likely it is to be an anagen, and that makes sense, right? It needs to get all that, all that blood supply and has to get all those signals in order to properly grow the hair from the follicle. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, the reason why I've been obsessing about ultrasound imaging and the scalp is because in the literature, when it comes to hair loss pathologies like Lichen planopilaris or frontal fibrosing alopecia, CCCA, all these sort of weird alopecias outside of androgenetic alopecia. I guess you can also include androgenetic alopecia's end stage, where you get fibrosis. We typically use biopsies, but the literature doesn't have that much, certainty on the rates of Lichen planopilaris. I interviewed right now he's one of the co-founders of Amplifica, but he's, essentially the founding father of the modern day hair transplant procedures, Dr. William Rassman. And when I talked to him, he said one of his colleagues, I think Dr. Shaver at the Bernstein Clinic in New York City, or in New York rather. I think it's New York City. But in that clinic, they essentially found that the more biopsies they do, the more that they discovered that the rates of Lichen planopilaris, or these weird lymphocytic autoimmune alopecias that destroy the hair follicle and create scar tissue, it's actually quite frequent, more than the literature suggests. And there are some issues with the literature in terms of how they sample the population. It is said that Lichen planopilaris and frontal fibrosing alopecia are conditions of, postmenopausal women, right? But let's be real here. It might be some sort of selection bias that's occurring, because if you go to a doctor, let's say a man goes to the doctor, complains about hair loss. Most of these dermatologists are just kind of looking at the scalp and just making a quick assessment, and they make a heuristic, assumption that that man is just dealing with and only dealing with androgenetic alopecia. But with women, there's typically further investigation, right? And because of that, they either order labs or they're a bit more minimally invasive with, scalp samples or, biopsies of some kind. And in doing so, now you're actually investigating, further, and you're going to find those issues if you're investigating more in a particular population, right? So I think that, nobody wants to go into a dermatologist's office and every month get a biopsy to see their antigen to telogen ratio. That would be ridiculous. And even more so, nobody wants to get their scalp cut into while they're already dealing with a hair loss disorder, because once you cut into that area of the scalp, it's going to be replaced with scar tissue. It's not going to be, a large amount of scar tissue if the dermatologist knows what they're doing, but you're still going to get scar tissue in that area, and nobody wants to facilitate that if it's unnecessary. Only if it is necessary, only if it is suspected that you do have some kind of, autoimmune hair loss condition. And by then, let's be real here, if you do you really need a biopsy? The biopsy is only trying to confirm if it's like lymphocytic or neutrophilic. So whether it's by, an autoimmune disease or maybe you're reacting to some kind of microbe. But at that point, you don't really have that much hair to begin with, right? You do a biopsy because you want to slow down the rate of what you're dealing with, the rate of, of the pathology. So in destroying those small amount of hair follicles, maybe like 21 or so, you can find out about the potential fate of the entire scalp. That's pretty important. Anyway, by using ultrasound imaging, in this particular study titled, quote, Ultrasound High Frequency Ultrasound with 70 megahertz Transducer in Hair Disorders, Development of Novel Non-Invasive Diagnostic Methodology, unquote. This is a really, really interesting study. I'll just skip to the point over here. So what we can see here is a healthy scalp. And these sort of tubular structures, these are hair follicles. So you're probably wondering, what the hell am I looking at? This is just a black and white image. Granted, that might be the case, but let's try to understand how to read these images, right? This might be helpful for you if you ever get some sort of ultrasound reading of yourself, right? Maybe an x-ray of some kind. So this webpage over here, Understanding Endoscopic Ultrasound and Fine Needle Aspiration. This is just a random paper, but it does have some utility here. And what you have to remember is that when a region is very, very dark, right, with no white marks whatsoever, it's like a black void, you're typically dealing with something that is encased with fluid, right? And how an ultrasound works is that you have a receiver right over here, and it emits a frequency, right? And that frequency goes through the body, and whatever it bounces back off of, it goes back to the receiver. And depending on how strong it bounces back off of that, tissue or spot in the body, it will produce an image, and that image is correlated to how much was reflected back by that particular structure. Anechoic, as you can see on the screen, if you're not, I'm just going to describe it to you. Anechoic is when there's no reflection. It's when essentially that beam, that ultrasound beam we send out, just goes right through that area. It doesn't bounce back to the receiver. Hypo, H-Y-P-O, hypoechoic is when you're getting some bounce back, but a lot of it is going right through the structure. And hyperechoic is when a lot of the ultrasound beam that you send out is being bounced back to the receiver, and that gives a very white sort of look to the structure you're bouncing the ultrasound beam at. This is another image, gives a good understanding. So it says anechoic, that's typically vascular fluid, cysts and nerves. Hypoechoic, soft tissue, fat, nerves, and you have muscles, sometimes, but it varies. And hyperechoic would be bone, tendon, ligaments, nerves, and really sometimes it can be very, very tissue that has lots of collagen to it, fibrosis in the tissue. With that being said, if you know how FUE hair transplant procedures look like, you can clearly see that a hair follicle is essentially a tubular structure from the base all the way up to the hair you actually see. This is what you're essentially transplanting. And really, you can see how wet it is, right? It's like this, sloshy thing, but it is an organ that has utility for growing the hair you actually see in these follicles. So basically, the hair is encased by this transparent sort of organ, and that is why you get this sort of black void, because for the most part, it's kind of liquidy, and you're not getting that much bounce back to the receiver. But if you look closely, let's zoom in a bit more. If you look closely, you can see that there is some kind of hypoechoic nature to the tubular imaging here, and that's probably due to, the hair itself that's coming out of the follicle. But all you have to know is that the tubular nature, the tubular voids that you see, right? These sort of tubular areas, that is where the hair follicles are. And now that we have an understanding of how it looks like in a healthy scalp, we can look at other things, right? The forehead over here, your forehead doesn't always have hair. Sometimes your forehead just has a thick layer, it may show some scars, or just has a lot of skin on it, right? And that's what essentially is being shown here. Just a bunch of skin, and maybe some acne scarring or whatever that used to be there superficially. But it's just skin. This guy doesn't have any hair on his forehead. Or gal, who knows? But now, let's look at alopecia areata. As you know, alopecia areata is an autoimmune non-scarring condition. What the researchers in this paper were able to find is that it has its own distinct look under ultrasound imaging. As you can see over here, it's very, very, confusing. It's all over the place. But what we have to make a note of is that the tubular structures have essentially collapsed, and it doesn't look like the control, the healthy scalp looks over here. It kind of looks like how the forehead looks like, because you have a lack of active hair follicles that are actually pushing out hair, and they're kind of closing up too, right? So that's pretty interesting. And then if you have chronic, alopecia areata, that's when you don't have any hair growing out of it, and it's just a bald area. One thing that's interesting to point, hopefully you guys can see this, there are tubular structures, but it's mostly encased with this hypo, and also a mixture of hyperechoic patterns. So what can we understand from this? We can see is that, yes, the follicles are there, the tubular structures do exist, but it's mostly covered by skin, and there's no hair to kind of displace the skin, right? Typically when a hair grows, it's under the skin and it comes out, it will at least, the follicle will at least widen up a bit. And that's why you get these sort of tubular structures, and the skin that was initially there would kind of be displaced and be, pushed outward. But over here, that's not the case. The skin is there. It's kind of closing in because the follicles is open. The follicle's there, but it's not growing any hair. Over here, when you're recovering from alopecia areata, you can see that there's some tubular openings, some open circles. It looks like they're priming themselves for hair growth, right? And then over here, the remission, as it shows, is that once again, the hair is finally growing out of the follicle. And like I said before, when the hair is growing, it's kind of displacing the areas of skin, right? So that's why you're starting to get more of the, as the follicle gets wider, the hair follicle gets wider, you're starting to get more of the anechoic and hypoechoic nature of the tubular structure that indicates it's a hair follicle. So that was a bunch of word salad, but hopefully you guys can see what I'm showing you. And if not, if you're driving or you're listening to me talk, hopefully the descriptions are good for you to understand, and you can always check out the study in the description below. Now let's look at other set of images we have over here. This is non-cicatricial or non-scarring alopecias, and this typically would include androgenetic alopecia or female pattern hair loss, but you're pretty much seeing a similar story, right? They actually make some pretty unique patterns to map out the hypoechoic and you can say the anechoic areas, right? So the anechoic areas are showing you the tubular structures, and the tubular structures, like I said before, is the hair follicles themselves, or are the hair follicles themselves, rather, sorry. So we can see over here, there is a mixture of hairs of different sizes, hair follicles of different widths. And what we know from androgenetic alopecia and female pattern hair loss, right? Essentially the same disorder. As hair is inhibited by dihydrotestosterone, over numerous cycles, it goes through a process called stepwise miniaturization. Hopefully I remember to put the image somewhere over here so you guys can see it. So over time, hair follicles that are less resilient, they shrink in their width and their size, and even the hairs that they produce also shrink as well. So with female pattern hair loss, it looks like you're kind of getting a range of different sort of widths and odd shapes due to that miniaturization. And it's thought that female pattern hair loss and male androgenetic alopecia, although they are essentially the same condition from what we know, both affected by androgens, particularly DHT or mainly DHT, the sort of progression in pathology for female pattern hair loss is kind of different from male androgenetic alopecia. I'll put a screenshot of the image, but if you're interested to see the study that shows that, it will be in the description below. Anyway, if we look at the typical male androgenetic alopecia over here, it's kind of the same thing, right? But compared to the female pattern hair loss, you're mostly dealing with a lot of thin hair follicle. Mostly they're all thin. You don't have any thick terminal ones or intermediate ones. Whereas over here for female pattern hair loss, you have a mixture of terminal ones, of intermediate ones, and vellus ones. For severe androgenetic alopecia, it's a mixture, and they're almost all vellus, or I guess you can say kind of, thinned out a bit. For telogen effluvium, this is really interesting. So remember when I showed you the image, right, from Dr. Wortsman? And it shows that as a hair follicle is tending towards the telogen phase, when it goes from anagen, that means its active growth phase. When it's when it's out of its active growth phase and it goes into catagen, and then from catagen it goes to telogen, it approaches towards the top of the outer skin layer, the stratum corneum, and it becomes like this sort of circular structure. Well, let's go back to the study we were looking at. What do you see here? You see these circles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, from what I can count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I guess this says 7. But you see something interesting, right? They're going past the subcutaneous towards the upper parts of the dermis. And that is because those hair follicles are intelligent. And like I said before, you can possibly predict if someone's going to shed by looking at the number of hair follicles that are in catagen by using an ultrasound high frequency sort of imaging. So that's pretty interesting. So this is cool. And over here, right, like you can see something similar, right? You see, a collection of these sort of like hair follicles. Some of them, are in odd shapes and sizes. But this is all things that we can use to essentially understand what's going on with our scalp, right? And it's also about the accessibility of using these kinds of tools. It's kind of hard, right? You're not really going to find ultrasound imaging that you can just buy, in a consumer sort of interface, but maybe you can. Now, when it comes to cicatricial alopecia, it's split into two categories. The one I think, for the most part, we're looking at is the lymphocytic kind. So Lichen planopilaris, we get the active scarred, frontofibrosing alopecia, active scarred, CCCA, and discoid, I think this is discoid lupus erythemiosis. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And then folliculitis decalvans, that is a neutrophilic alopecia because it involves, the neutrophils attacking bacteria. So let's have a deeper look into this. What do we see here? With active lichen planopilaris, you're seeing, hair follicles that would otherwise be in an active state of growth becoming very inflamed. And the imaging over here, where they trace it out for us, kind of tells us that's, that story, right? Over here in the follicle, and I'm tempted to say that this is where the stem cell bulge is. It looks like there's an inflammation occurring, and that's causing the follicle to kind of be disrupted, to be broken, right? Over here, the follicle even breaks apart. And when I say follicle, I'm not saying the hair inside of the follicle. I mean the literal hair follicle that's growing the hair. These organs, right? This fatty structure is important for hair growth. It's breaking. It's just breaking apart. That's pretty bad. Because what happens is that if you're noticing an inflammation that's occurring in the stem cell bulge area, which is typically, towards the top of the hair follicle. That means if that is scarred or destroyed, the hair follicle may never grow again. So this is LPP, Lichen planopilaris, when it's active. Lichen planopilaris over here, when it's scarred. Let's look at that. What do you have? You have a collection of these sort of striated lines with different hyperacoicity and hypoacoicity, but mostly it's all striated, and we can't really see any, visible tubular structures. With that being the case, that means you're dealing with fibrosis. And when you're dealing with fibrosis, unfortunately, right, depending on the layer of skin, this is mostly in the dermis. That means you've dealt with a lot of scar tissue, and you've possibly destroyed the hair follicle. If we can't even see an indication of a follicle that's, in anagen or telogen, it typically means the follicle is kind of destroyed, unfortunately. So this is end stage Lichen planopilaris. You're likely not going to get any sort of hair growth back in this state. Very sad. And notice how destructive Lichen planopilaris is. It pretty much destroyed the dermis layer. Remember, let's look at our map real quick. This is our map, right? Subcutis, and this is the dermis, right? And what Lichen planopilaris did is that it's not just destroying the hair follicles, it's destroying the skin, the dermis. That's pretty bad. Look at that. All gone. Now, if we're looking at the frontal fibrosing alopecia, what do we notice? Okay, it's similar to Lichen planopilaris, right? They're pretty much the same disease. It's just one is like occurring maybe throughout the scalp or in localized area, and then frontal fibrosing alopecia is occurring at the hairline area, hence frontal. And what we see is a typical story, right? At the top of the hair follicle structure, you're seeing a lot of inflammation, a lot of, this bulge, this circular bulge. And if that's happening on top of the tubular structure, that indicates that there's some sort of inflammation going on, that it's expanding in this odd way, and it's being, filled with fluid, right? And again, in these issues, in these, autoimmune conditions, your lymphocytes are causing an inflammation sort of issue in the area, inflammatory issue in the area that creates a sort of unique fingerprint. What's interesting about frontal fibrosing alopecia is that what we can see here is, let's go to Lichen planopilaris first, LPP scarred, right? Is scarred, but with frontal fibrosing alopecia, the follicular units, the tubular structures are scarred, right? And that essentially, these are areas of hyperacoic bands, and that is where the hair follicles kind of used to be. So in both cases, the hair follicles are destroyed, but I guess in frontal fibrosing alopecia, what we're seeing here is that there's less fibrosis at the dermis layer. So it's, I guess, less destructive in that regard. So possibly, if the disease has been arrested, you probably could get a hair transplant, and it would probably fare better in frontal fibrosing alopecia than it would with Lichen planopilaris, because with Lichen planopilaris, the fibrosis is just way too severe for probably anything to take hold. So that's something to take into account. Now let's move over here, right? CCCA, that is, I think it's, let's see if I remember this. Central cicatricial alopecia. I don't know. You guys put it in the comments section. It's something like that. Centrifugal cicatricial alopecia, something to that accord. But we see something kind of similar, I guess you can say, but it's kind of odd. You see something similar to what we saw with frontal fibrosing alopecia, where, the dermis is not too scarred, so to speak, but the hair follicles are in this sort of compromised, area, right? There's like these huge gaps where you're dealing with scar tissue of some kind. So that sucks. But you do have these like odd patterns of, inflammation here and there. But perhaps the destruction to the dermis is not as severe with Lichen planopilaris as you see there. This is, I think this is discoid lupus erythemiosis, something like that. Sounds like a magical spell. I'm just saying it from memory. But yeah, very odd imaging. It's kind of weird because there is a huge amount of, area that has just pretty much collapsed into what would eventually be scar tissue. And this is folliculitis decalvans over here, where it says FD. And what you see, at least what's cool to me, what I see here, is the classic sign of the tuft hairs, where, the hair follicles are becoming constrained due to the inflammation caused by, bacteria, specific strands of bacteria, where it's forcing a bunch of hair follicles to clump together and come through one shoot. And looks like that's happening over here in the imaging. So it's pretty interesting. You see the tubular structures kind of collapse and radiate outward into this sort of singular unit. A lot of clumping in wide areas, active inflammation, and that's pretty much as it is. And TA over here, yeah, we can see a similar story. There's a lot of spacing between the hair follicles, and you can see some hair follicles here and there. This is traction alopecia, by the way, but you can see some hair follicles that are still active. They're still, terminal. They're still wide, but lots of empty space and kind of fibrosis, fibrotic areas in the dermis. And I guess if we're looking at, just a quick overview, depending on how deep the fibrosis is, this is going to the subcutis. That kind of indicates, with Lichen planopilaris, how severe this kind of scarring alopecia is. But pretty much they have a similar pathology. Oh, I was wrong. So DC is not discoid lupus, it's dissecting cellulitis. So, it is what it is. But as you can see, that's my sort of overview. Hopefully you guys can understand it. But I just want to give a takeaway point here. Even though I was rambling a lot, hopefully you guys can just listen to what I have to say real quick. This sort of imaging can help a lot of people understand if their hair loss is even recoverable. To what extent can they recover? Can they, suspect a shedding that might occur? Maybe they can actively monitor their hair shedding by using such tools like this. And if we were to have a commercial tool, that would be very, very useful, right? So I don't know, guys, let me know in the comment section. Would you use an ultrasound imaging tool to kind of see what's going on with your hair follicles? Or do you think that's like a bit overkill? To me, I think it would be cool if consumers, could access this sort of technology at the comfort of their own home. That'd be really nice. And if there was some sort of like imaging software that can actually guide them in what they're actually looking at, that would be really cool. Because we no longer have to do biopsies. This is a biopsy-free, radiation-free, essentially, sort of imaging process. Very useful. And, hopefully, this can, inspire some people, or maybe some people can go to the doctor and try to pursue something like this, right? I've already interviewed Dr. Ximena Wortsman. I'll put the interview in the description. But anyway, I'm done rambling. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and hopefully you got something out of it. Peace out, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.